Hello friends, and welcome to the first of what will be 2 lectures on the institution within American government that has gained the most power in your lifetime and really in the last 100 years. And that institution is the American presidency. And we'll begin to talk about the duties of the presidency, both what they are in terms of the Constitution and how they have evolved. So I would urge you to follow the PowerPoint and follow my lecture notes, and I think this is going to be a very revealing and insightful opportunity for us to evaluate this central piece of the American governmental puzzle. As you know, when we look to the Constitution, the outline of the presidency, the president's duties, are to be found in Article 2, not Article 1. So in many ways, the president was not seen as the pivotal figure in American politics. There are a lot of things about the presidency that were not really ironed out, so to speak, in the Constitutional Convention, and are still really in some ways being ironed out today. One of the challenges of studying the presidency is the realization that the duties of the presidency have changed as the country has changed. And in essence, in many regards, the presidency has become a much more powerful institution than what the framers had initially intended for it to be. This itself is a fascinating aspect of the study of American government. We want to look at basically 4 areas. The President is the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. He is the person, if Congress proposes laws and enacts laws, it's the President who carries them out. So we want to look at the President as the enforcer in the American political system in many ways, and really not the President himself, but the agencies and the federal government that fall under the presidency. What the actual founders thought that the president should do, and we're going to refer to that as the constitutional powers, how these have changed over time, and then use the ideas and insights of a famous 20th century political scientist by the name of Clinton Rossiter, who taught for many years at Cornell, was one of the best students of the American presidency, to look at what he views as the current powers. And the key aspect of our analysis will be to look at the differences between the constitutional powers of the presidency and the current powers. Let's reflect for a moment about the president's duties in relation to law enforcement and national security. For the most part, most Americans obey the laws. Most Americans are not under any kind of judicial decree. Most Americans are not in prison. Most Americans are basically, in the minds of their fellow citizens, are basically good people trying to do good things. Now, there are obviously some, or perhaps many exceptions to that. So the president's whole life and work and tenure in office is not devoted to just law enforcement. But the president is the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. Now, the president, of course, is not the only law enforcement officer. Criminal justice, policing, internal security is basically a state and local function, as we talked about earlier in the semester when we talked about federalism. Now, if you are arrested, as we talked about, we know that the chances of being arrested by a federal law enforcement officer aren't very good, unless you've done something very serious or involves an international component to the alleged crimes or something of that sort. If you're arrested in Oakwood or Gainesville or Watkinsville or Athens, you're probably going to be arrested by a local law enforcement officer or a state law enforcement officer. Law enforcement in the United States in the 21st century is mainly a state and local function. And if you are arrested and you have to go to court, it'll be a local court as well. So the president is only involved if it is a national issue. And there are national law enforcement agencies. In fact, the whole national security umbrella organization, our 15th new and most recent cabinet office that reports to the President, is Department of Homeland Security. That doesn't mean that state and local governments are not very much involved in that as well. Indeed, they are. Now, one of the trickier areas between national and state governments involves the National Guard. And this includes most branches of the military, but especially the Army. And each state has a national or local guard. These fall under peacetime under the control of state governors. Georgia, for example, has a National Guard, and the Georgia National Guard falls under the governor's leadership. Now, in times of military conflict, especially, let's say, in times of war, or even if it's an undeclared military situation that is not being called a war but being called something else, although it resembles war in every way, like our current involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq, the National Guard that is under the control of a governor can be federalized and fall under the individual soldiers and their units or battalions or brigades or divisions would fall under federal supervision. They'd fall under active duty military units. They would become part of the U.S. Army, even though they are in reality as National Guards, National Guard women. And the control would move from the governor to the President. For example, when our military is deployed overseas, let's say our current involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, if the President is to deploy or wants to deploy National Guard units, he must formally request permission from the state governors that will be involved. However, and this is a key point, governors appear to have a check on the use of their forces, but in reality they will always go along with the President because it's both in their interest, and the President probably has the authority to use them for that purpose anyway. Next, we turn to the fundamental powers of the presidency, the constitutional powers. These are the powers that the President must assume, that you find, as we discussed, in Article 2 of the Constitution. These are unambiguous. Presidents must assume these responsibilities, and they become the heart. They are the original responsibilities. As I mentioned, when we come to the 20th and 21st century duties of the presidency, we'll see that they are greatly expanded from these duties. And so scholars who argue for the constitutional integrity of the presidential office will affirm these purely constitutional powers. Well, what are we talking about? Well, first of all, the President commands the armed forces. The President is the commander-in-chief, even though he or she may never have had any military service. A good example of this is Barack Obama. He was never in the military. He never served in either the active duty or reserve components of the military. He has no personal involvement with the military. However, because in America, civilian, by that I mean non-military personnel, are in charge of the Army, which is an interesting concept in itself. Take a moment and reflect on that. Why would we want a civilian to be in charge of the military? What do you think? One reason, and a convincing reason, is that we didn't want the person in charge of the military to also be in charge of the government. So the control of the government should not be in the hands of the military. We find that very often in the case in the world today, and usually it's not the best circumstances to live under, because the military have perhaps different priorities than civilian rulers. So military is always under civilian leadership. So the President is a civilian. The President cannot be a general, for example, nor could a general run for office. as a active duty military general or admiral. But we do not require anywhere in the Constitution that the President have a military background. It's an interesting question to ask, should the President have a military background? What most polling and most analyses of this issue suggest is that your generation is less likely to value that as highly as, for example, my generation, or certainly my parents or your grandparents' generation, because they were very highly valued military experience. It's definitely not a requirement. We begin with Barack Obama. President Obama has no military background, even though today he is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. When he walks on board an aircraft carrier, every naval personnel, all naval personnel, from the lowest ranking person to the admiral on board, they all salute him because he's the commander-in-chief. When he visits Fort Stewart, South Georgia, largest land base in the U.S. Army, and he enters the base, every person salutes him because he, as the civilian commander-in-chief, in actuality outranks them. So the President is the commander of the armed forces and the highest ranking person, even though he doesn't have typical military rank. He has the highest ranking of commander-in-chief. Okay, let's do a quick little pleasant survey of recent presidents and see how this idea of that presidents need military background works out. Well, President Obama, no military background whatsoever. Of course, his predecessor, two-term president, George W. Bush, was in the Texas National Guard, Air Guard actually, at a somewhat controversial time, which was actually also quite brief during the Vietnam era, and never saw combat duty. And the president before him, William Jefferson Clinton, of course, no military experience whatsoever, like President Obama. Before President Clinton, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41, the father, of course, of the 43rd president, George W. Bush. Bush 41 was actually a Navy pilot during the Second World War, was shot down, and his plane crashed, and only he and one other person on the plane survived. He is often viewed as a naval war hero for his combat service, and he is the last World War II era president, of course, that the country will have. Before President Bush was President Reagan. President Reagan did serve in the military, but his time was spent, I believe, essentially making movies to promote the war effort and to train military personnel. Before President Reagan, President Carter is a naval veteran, and President Carter served on the submarine force with the very famous Admiral Rickover, and I also believe he is a graduate of the Naval Academy. So it gives you some idea of his background and attachment to the military. Before President Carter, President Gerald R. Ford, military experience. Before President Ford, President Nixon. President Nixon had significant military experience. Was a World War II veteran as well. Before President Nixon, his predecessor was Lyndon Johnson. President Johnson was in the military, but I'm not sure he was deployed to a combat setting. Before President, his predecessor, of course, is John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, who was a Navy veteran and saw significant combat duty in the Pacific arena and was seriously injured when his small boat PT-109 was hit by a Japanese cruiser, direct hit. Some of his crew members, I believe, perished. He was severely injured, had a back injury that would continue throughout his life, and he saved several of his compatriots. And there is a nice movie made about this, if you ever want to see sort of a version of his military service, called PT-109. It was made probably in the 60s. It's late 60s, early 70s. It's really an interesting flick. Now, before President John Kennedy, his immediate predecessor was Dwight David Eisenhower. And this is kind of a good juxtaposition. Dwight David Eisenhower was a very senior military person, a 5-star general, a very rare tribute that only Congress can give a president, or give a general, excuse me. And he was given this title. He's one of the few 5-star presidents in American military history. So he is very much a military person, a very successful military career, the commander of Allied forces in the Second World War, an incredibly powerful figure in the military realm. So really we can kind of compare Dwight David Eisenhower to President Clinton and President Obama, who have no military experience, and there may be a trend here that you can continue to observe and think about, but regardless of whether they served or not, at the end of the day, the president is in charge of the armed forces. Well, what else does Article 2 tell us? The president has to repel an attack. The president has the right, even though Congress is the only branch that can declare war, because it represents the largest group of the American people in as most diverse and as deep a manner as possible. The president can send troops, and most presidents have considered or engaged in these kinds of actions if we're attacked. In some ways, the great example of this in your lifetime, in my lifetime, is when we were attacked on September 11, 2001. President Bush very quickly, in 2001, sends troops to Afghanistan, and in 2002 sends troops to Iraq, and we still have troops on the ground in both countries. Along with these duties, the President commissions military officers. Every military officer makes a pledge to support the Commander-in-Chief. So this establishes the Army's chain of command. And so officers report to the person above them, and all the senior military report to the President. If there is a constitutional crisis, political crisis, the Congress can be called into session by a president, which is another duty. And this usually happens when it concerns national security issues. Now, the president often in the 21st century, and President Obama has done this as well as President Bush, if there is a budgetary crisis, the president may often use the threat of calling Congress into session. That means bringing them back to Washington, putting them back to work if there is a crisis. Finally, the president either approves or vetoes legislation. Now, what that means is that the president must either approve, say yes, or the president must veto, saying no, to any bill, any piece of legislation, any big idea that Congress sends his way. If the president, and that's part of our checks and balances too, the president must approve it. If the president signs a bill into law that Congress has given him, it's the law. Now, the president has the option to say no, and we're going to talk about vetoes later. But a veto is when the president says no to something Congress has passed, some piece of legislation. Now, that's not the end of the story. Congress can override the presidential veto by 2/3 of both houses. Other presidential duties include the appointment of the folks who will run the executive branch, the executing branch, the governing branch, the day-to-day work of the federal government. So the president appoints really about 1% of all the key officials in American government. Now that 1% is usually the secretaries of the 15 departments that run and the alphabet soup of independent agencies. The president also appoints ambassadors to other countries that we recognize and with whom we have diplomatic relations. So the president also is very involved in that process. Now, new ambassadors from other countries, their chief representative in the United States, are received by the president. And the president also nominates our representatives, our chief representatives to other countries. And they have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. There are two kinds of ambassadors that are appointed by American presidents. The first are career foreign service people. These are experts in foreign affairs and foreign policy, and these are people that may have a political connection to the president, but usually the hotter, the more conflict there is in the country, the more likely you are to have a foreign service appointee. They still have to be approved by the Senate. The other half are presidential patronage appointments, people who support the president, gave money to his campaign, friends of the president. Sometimes these are given the other half of ambassadors, and they also must be confirmed by the Senate, but they're usually sent to less confrontational areas. The president's also our chief negotiator to the world and to other countries, and so it is the president who negotiates treaties. Treaties are agreements between either the U.S. and another country or the U.S. and more than one other country. Treaties between the U.S. and another country we call bilateral treaties. Between the United States and various other countries we call multilateral treaties. For example, we have multilateral treaties on all kinds of issues, and bilateral treaties on a broad array of issues as well. One of the multilateral treaties are the various nuclear arms reduction treaties that are very much in place. Copyright laws, the law of the sea, many others that sort of guide our actions and behavior. The president also is the source of the executing power of government, as we've already mentioned. It's the president that is ultimately charged. When Congress passes laws, the Supreme Court makes a decision, it's the president that has to carry it out. It's the executive branch that has to carry it out. So which brings us to the notion of Article 2, that the president faithfully executes the laws that have been enacted. It's the president's job, even though he or she someday may not actually like a law, if Congress has passed it, and if it's been enacted, often cases by a previous president, then it's their mission to carry it out. So those are the constitutional duties that are mandated for the presidency. Now we turn to the Rossiter, and that's spelled R-O-S-S-I-T-E-R model of some current presidential powers. And they're going to be a great expansion from what the Constitution says, which tells you a lot about the growth of the power of the office of the president. So we're going to go over those very quickly. Rossiter says the president is the chief executive. He's the CEO of American government, not too different from Article 2. The president's the chief of state, chief representative, chief diplomat. These are all very similar. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. These are very similar to Article 2. But here we see a change in the growth of the presidency and the growth of the responsibilities of the presidency. We then have this idea of the model of chief legislator or coalition builder, that the president then becomes the person who brings Congress together, proposes ideas. In reality, as we know when we looked at Congress, the president cannot propose legislation to Congress. But in the 21st century, the president actually proposes Congress through his friends who are in the House and in the Senate. So the president, in a sense, does propose his own budget. In fact, one great example of this is the budget, because in the 21st century, just about 60 days ago, the president submitted his budget to Congress before Congress. So his budget kind of sets the agenda. So the president now becomes, even though the president cannot constitutionally submit legislation, the president becomes the person who sort of sets the debate. President also the head of his political party. That means that he sets the agenda for his political party. The next category that Rossiter gives us is that the president is the voice of the people. The president is the only person who is elected by all Americans, whether we voted for him or not, and through this mechanism we call the Electoral College. The president is the only voice that all the American people have in some ways helped decide. So that makes the president unique. When we have the president is the only person who can rightfully claim to speak for the American people, even if that's a fairly imprecise threshold of judgment. The last and somewhat the most adventurous versions of Rossiter's model is the protector of the peace. We expect the president to protect American security, American interests, and to keep us out of conflict. So the president uses all of those treaty negotiating powers, diplomatic powers, the power of the office itself to keep us out of conflict. We also view the president as the manager of prosperity. We expect the president to keep the good times rolling in America, to keep economic growth advancing, more chickens and more pots, so to speak, to borrow a phrase from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that is. And unfortunately, this is one of those areas that most of the control is out of the hands of the president, although we do know, for example, in voting behavior, that presidents are more likely to be elected, or certainly re-elected an existing president, if things are going well. For example, here we are towards the end of March in 2012. President Obama is certainly aggressively seeking re-election. His biggest concern in terms of the economy are the high gas prices. That could negatively affect his campaign. Well, on to another category, the leader of the free world. Now, how'd you like that on the name tag? You can't beat that. The president, because we are in a unilateral world where America is the most powerful country, then the president becomes the de facto and sometimes in reality the leader of those countries. And the most important economy, the most powerful military, not the largest military in terms of personnel, and the most powerful force in the world. Lastly, the idea of crisis management. When we have a problem, Rossiter suggests we turn to the presidency to solve those issues. This is something very different from Article 2, very different from what the founders anticipated. And so these current presidential powers speak of a president that is much more powerful, has much more of an international role than the founders could have anticipated. Think about these two and consider comparing them to each other, because this will in all probability be an essay question on the third exam.